Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Newsam's Night TV studio and another edition of Inside Media. I'm your host, John Maynard. Last month, the Newsam opened up the HP New Media Gallery, which we think shows visitors in a fun and engaging way how technology has reshaped the media landscape. The gallery explores milestone moments in the history of new media, allows you to create your own tablet-based news page and post live Twitter feeds. And there's even a Dunk the News Anchor quiz game, testing your knowledge of new media. Well, our guest today will probably do pretty well at the Dunk the Anchor game. We're joined today by New York Times media reporter Brian Stelter, who's been called the embodiment of new media. Brian joined the New York Times right out of college in 2007. And I will also add, as a prolific Twitter user and writer, at last count he had over 120,000 Twitter followers, as well as other social media outlets. Brian writes about television and the web, both for the paper and the paper's blog, Media Decoder. Before joining the Times, he was founder and editor of TV Newser, the preeminent blog about the television news industry, which he started in college. Just how powerful was TV Newser with Brian at the helm? Well, none other than NBC's Brian Williams told USA Today in 2006, quote, "TV Newser is the closest thing to the Bible of what's going on in our industry, but it's a little disconcerting knowing that the main pulse of your industry is being taken by someone who cannot legally take a drink." Well, ladies and gentlemen, he's now old enough to have a drink. Please welcome Brian Stelter. And Brian, I do want to get to...
It's a good quote.
Yeah, isn't that great?
I forgot about that quote. That's clever.
I want to get to new media, but first I want to bring up, you had an A1 story in the New York Times this week about how gay characters in television are just not a big deal anymore on shows like Modern Family, Glee, Grey's Anatomy. What effect do you think this is having on society overall?
This story is kind of funny because it's a non-story. It's a classic case of seeing something that no one's talking about and thinking that's newsworthy in and of itself.
Right.
And it only happens once in a while, but my editor a year ago pointed out to me that there's no longer any boycotts or campaigns or complaints about shows that have gay characters prominently in them. Of course, right. Ellen 15 years ago was boycotted, and Will and Grace was the subject of ire. And now nobody complains. Right. That was his point. Now, it took me a year to get the story on the front page. Sure. The timing, though, was perfect because that was the day President Obama came out and supported gay marriage. Right. So it looked really smart for us to have a story about gay characters on the front of the paper. Right. It is interesting to me, though, that it's happened so quickly. You know, 15 years ago when Ellen was going to jokingly kiss a female friend on Ellen, on the show called Ellen, they put a warning label in front of the show that said, "This due to adult content, parent discretion is advised." And now, of course, Cameron and Mitchell on Modern Family kiss all the time, and no one notices it anymore. Right, so it's funny to see how fast television might be changing. Yeah, absolutely. Another topic you're on top of is the morning news programs. A little history was made last month when Good Morning America, ABC's morning show, took over the Today Show for at least a week as the top-rated morning news show. How big a deal is that for ABC? There's no race in television like the morning show race. It's amazing how fierce it's fought. And there's also no race in television like it because Today's Show on NBC have been on top for 16 years. There's no other streak like that on television. And probably no other streak like it in the media. If you really think about it, nobody's been on top like that for 16 years. So GMA at ABC, Good Morning America, winning at least for a week was a hugely symbolic moment. I happen to be doing a book about morning TV, so the timing was beautiful. It's strange though for me. Even if Today comes back and wins, it's still a good story. Right. It's a rare case of a story where I don't care what happens because I'm going to come out with a great story either way. But I'm in the middle of writing it, and I suspected this year when I was working on the book that we'd have some conflict in the race because ABC had been creeping up for years. But I was still amazed to see it happen because there's two types of people in America. There's people that wake up with the Today Show and people that don't. When you don't wake up with the Today Show, you're choosing not to. It's like Coke. You know, it is the Coke of television, and so it's making for a very interesting race this year. Right. Big moneymaker. Huge. Well, Today is the single most profitable program on TV because it goes on for 4 hours, and and it really basically what it does, people don't realize, it really pays for the rest of the news division. So NBC Nightly News will have a reporter in Afghanistan, but that's thanks to the Today Show interviewing some actress or actor. You know, it really subsidizes the rest, and so that's why I think it was such a notable moment last month. Right. I want to get a little bit now to new media. You know, when we opened the Newsam in 2008, we already felt like we were behind the 8 ball in one sense.
our digital news gallery was somewhat limited. I think we had a Kindle on display. You know, and while we were planning this place, Twitter hadn't existed.
Right.
Facebook was just being used by college kids. YouTube wasn't nearly what it is today. So my question to you is, you know, how much has digital media changed since we opened in 2008, and certainly since you were writing your blog in college?
It does feel as if the pace of change is accelerating, you know, and very hard then to slow it down. I think of Twitter as being the best example because Twitter was born 6 years ago, but really only gained momentum the last 3 years, and really only in the last 2 years. And now, if you look on television at night, there's usually hashtags for Twitter in the corner of the screen, and those have only been there a year, and you can only see it growing from there. Facebook, another great example, because of the nearly $100 billion IPO that's about to happen. But I think the way to keep up, the way to not get swept, you know, overwhelmed, I guess, by the pace of change, is to experiment on every one of the platforms. I tell college students that they should at least sign up for these new sites that come along. They don't have to love them. They don't have to keep using them, but they should at least try them. Because through trying them, we're going to figure out what they're useful for or not. Right now, the hot social network is Pinterest. Now, I don't use it. A lot of people do. I've at least tried it because maybe someday there's going to be some sort of journalistic application of it that we can't predict yet. To me, right now, Twitter and Facebook are the two key ones, but you know, we at least have to try the new ones that come along and see if they're the right fit or not.
Right. How do you use, on a daily basis, Twitter and Facebook, other social media outlets, to guide?
Sorry, Twitter. I was going to say Twitter to me is the most important tool for my job because it's, you know, and not the computers aren't, but let's put aside the computer and the telephone. Twitter's the most important because it's a giant antenna for me, and I can turn it in any direction I want. I can listen to TV executives or TV viewers or people in Asia or people in Europe or people in South America. I can listen to rich people or poor people or liberals or conservatives. And I try to listen to all of them. I try to listen to lots of people on Twitter to get a it gives me good feedback about my audience, about who, you know, the audience that I want to have as well as the readers that I do have. And it also allows me to improve my stories all the time in subtle ways, just by putting stories online, asking the Twitter universe for feedback, and allowing them to poke holes in it, ask questions, give me thoughts, give me ideas. Facebook is becoming a similarly useful tool in that way because Facebook now allows you to subscribe to people. You know, for about 6 years, all you could do was friend someone on Facebook, and for a lot of journalists, they didn't want to be random friends with hundreds of thousands of readers. But now you can subscribe to people on Facebook, and that really opens the door to this world where we subscribe to individuals, or we subscribe to companies, or we subscribe to politicians. It's early days there, but I see that being a really powerful opportunity. Right. For people that might not want to sign up for the New York Times, but will want to sign up for me or another reporter, to be able to do that on Facebook, it's going to give us some of that same power that we have on Twitter now. Right. But to me, that's pretty early days.
Right. And you somewhat referred to this just in your last answer, but I know in the past you refer to tweets as, you know, when you tweet a preview of your story, for instance, it's a rough draft.
Right, right. If news happens at noon and we put it on the website, you know, it is by definition a rough draft because it's going to improve all day until it gets into the paper. Right. But by telling my audience it's a rough draft, I think it clues them into the idea that they can all contribute. They can all make it better.
Have there been examples when a course of your story has changed because of some of the tweets you were getting back or Facebook?
I've definitely rewritten my stories based on feedback from the audience during the day. You know, oftentimes newspapers are challenged because if a news story happens at noon, well, we have it online by 1 o'clock. Today, the CEO of Yahoo is getting shoved out. Well, it happened at 12. It was on our website at 12:15. And what are we going to write for the print edition at 8 p.m. or 10 p.m.? That's going to be hard to figure out. We end up writing a story that could run days from now tonight. Right. But I think the Twitter audience helps us figure out what is that next story to be writing. By getting feedback from people, by getting quotes from people, by getting complaints from people. I appreciate when people tell me I'm missing something in my story because it helps make my story better. And it does take a different mindset for reporters to have, but I do think that's happening now widespread throughout the paper and places like it. Thanks to a combination of reader email and Twitter and Facebook, we can now pretty dramatically improve our stories during the day thanks to that feedback.
When you post, when you tweet and post on Facebook, do you always need to follow the New York Times standards of journalism, sort of in the back of your head? I mean,
for sure.
Can you tweet as Brian Stelter, citizen? You know?
Well, I can and I can't. Okay. The Times has a wonderful policy about what we do outside of the Times, and it's a 3-word policy. It's don't be stupid. And I appreciate that. I'm glad they haven't tried to put draconian rules on a site like Twitter or on public speaking like this. The rule basically is to realize you're always a reporter, in the same way that a politician knows they're always a politician, they're always possibly on camera. By saying only don't be stupid, we can then experiment. But I do know when I tweet that I'm still being held to relatively speaking, the same standards that I am for the newspaper. I may be able to float something on Twitter. For instance, on Wednesday, when Barack Obama was announced as he was going to give an interview to ABC. We didn't know what it was going to be about, but we all thought it was about gay marriage. You could tiptoe up to that line and let people in on the internal deliberations of the newsroom without, of course, going out and saying, he's going to talk about gay marriage, period. Sometimes there's a big difference between a question mark and a period, or an exclamation point and a question mark. Right. And as long as you, I think, write it in the right way and set the right tone, you can experiment online in that way.
In the Page One documentary, which we're going to see a clip of in just a moment, but you were quoted as saying you don't know why anybody who's a reporter isn't on Twitter.
I went a little too far in my youth.
Okay.
In 2010.
So you want to retract that?
Well, so what I had said was I don't know why any reporter isn't on Twitter. Now I would say I don't know why most reporters aren't on Twitter.
Okay.
To each their own social network.
Right.
For an education reporter, Facebook might be more useful to talk to high school students or to reach out to their parents. For me, Twitter's more useful. For others, Tumblr, which is a micro-blogging site. It's a really easy way to post pictures. Might be the best, but I think everybody probably should be on one of them, but it's more flexible than that.
Let's talk about the generational gap. I mean, are young people still well ahead of their elders in using digital tools? I mean, there's plenty of grandparents that are on Facebook these days.
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure.
So.
And of course, you know, our average audience for the newspaper is in their 40s or 50s or 60s. So I think the fact that we have such great followings now on social networks speaks to the fact that all ages are using these tools. And I think the combination of tablets, easy to use smartphones, and easy to use computers is making that more possible. You know, our audience online is about 10 years younger than it is in print. But it's still, you know, relatively middle-aged. Relatively, I call it old because I'm 26, but middle-aged. And that's, you know, that makes a lot of sense to me. But the web allows us to pull in a younger audience that probably did not grow up reading the paper, probably will not grow up reading the paper, and yet we can reach them online in a way we couldn't otherwise, and that's exciting to me.
You mentioned tablets, and I talked to a lot of people throughout the museum during the day. We have on our 6th floor, as many of you probably have seen, our Front Pages gallery, which features front pages from that day. And I'm always told, and by young and old alike, that people, you know, they might read on their PDAs, but they still love to spread out that newspaper on the kitchen table every morning, like I do. Are tablets bring us back to that a bit? I mean, you know, it's obviously a little bit more spread out.
I think they are. Do you buy the Times in print, the New York Times?
I do. Friday through Sunday. Friday through Sunday.
Thank you.
The weekend edition.
I should thank people individually these days for doing that.
Yeah.
I don't, although I do now buy the Sunday paper. I think I'm growing up because I now go to the newsstand and buy for $5 or $6 a Sunday paper. And I realize I would pay $10 now. I'd pay $15 because of the experience, because what you're buying is an experience. You're not just buying a newspaper. But I do think print's going to become this luxury product in that way. Maybe it's going to cost $15 for the Sunday paper in 10 years. Although don't quote me saying that. That's kind of scary. You know, I do think that as print becomes a luxury product, tablets may fill the void that is formed. The tablet, in my mind, is the best way to consume news. Right. It may not be for everybody, but I think everybody will eventually own them, whether it's a Kindle or an iPad or whatever we haven't invented yet. And through the combination of all those, I think we're going to be able to recreate some of the great things about print without having to pay hundreds of millions of dollars to print the newspaper. I don't think people realize how much money it costs and how many trees it costs and how much waste is expended every day through print. Certainly I have a warm, fuzzy feeling about being in the print newspaper, but the tablet is going to be a superior way to consume it. And I don't know if that's a 3-year, a 5-year, or a 10-year transition, but it's going to happen.
Right. I want to show a clip from Page One. Not sure if you've all had a chance to see this terrific documentary that came out.
It's on Netflix.
It's on Netflix, about a year in the life of the New York Times. Nate, if you could throw that up, and then I'll ask you a question about that. Should be coming in. Nate, are you there?
So this is about Wikileaks, which is a website which calls itself an intelligence agency for the people. And yesterday, I posted this video of a U.S. serial attack where there were 12 people killed. It felt like a possible front page story to Bruce and I. So now basically the assignment for the rest of the day is to keep the story interesting to editors.
Hey, did you send it?
Oh, I didn't, there was a note in there.
Did you?
I didn't see from you. I'm going to check.
Oh, he didn't send it. I knew he didn't send it.
I got to try Julian again because
True.
I have not heard back from him at all.
Hello.
Hi, it's Brian Stelter calling from the Times. There's a traditional definition of journalism that is objective, never breaking the law to obtain content. Do you view yourself as trying to achieve that definition?
The journalism is just a tool. We use a tool to get to the goal.
And tell me what the goal is. Tell me what the goal is.
Broadly, our goal is justice.
We're trying to do a front page story on what this means and what this means for journalism. I mean, clearly it's great for journalists in some ways because then it's out there. But it's this kind of collision of two worlds, like the sort of closed old world of expertise and classification and information and privacy, and this new world that just kind of wants to crack it all open.
So that was a segment, of course, Brian, interviewing Julian Assange about WikiLeaks. First of all, let's talk about the documentary itself. What was it like having these cameras following you around throughout the workday? Did it give you a better appreciation of reality television stars? Or?
It did actually make me realize that if I think reality TV is fake. If you want it to be real, it can be.
Yeah.
If people can point a camera at you and it can be very true, even the stuff I don't like in that film is very true. Right. It made me think the Kardashians maybe aren't making it all up.
Right,
I don't know,
yeah.
or some of it. I don't think I would have participated if I had known it was going to become a real film, because that would have been very scary. But I'm glad it did, because as journalists, we have to be better marketers. We are, sometimes when I joined the paper 5 years ago, I thought it was a fortress, almost impossible to get into. When I would call people to interview them, like Julian Assange, my number would come up as 11111. You couldn't even call back. We were like the CIA.
Right.
We've slowly started taking the walls down. Now when I call you, at least you can call back. And I think the film is an example of that. As we open ourselves up and we reveal that, yes, we're human beings, we're flawed, but we're trying to do our jobs. I think that's actually good for the paper overall. And I hope we keep doing a better job of letting people in like that.
What's the status on WikiLeaks these days and Julian Assange?
It seems to be in some ways marginalized because Julian Assange has been marginalized. He's being held under suspicion of wrong behavior for a long time now. He's been ostracized in a lot of ways by the public. And yet WikiLeaks is a fascinating example of what's happening to our world, which is that when everybody becomes a publisher, when anybody can publish, the walls completely fall down. And by the way, I'm excited by that world. It's a wonderful opportunity for a lot of people, but it is a very different world than what we grew up in, when the New York Times could decide, yes, we're going to state that or not. Well, now if we decide not to publish something, WikiLeaks can do it anyway. And I think it's almost such a big change we don't realize it's happening. As anybody can become a publisher, or anybody can become a reporter or act like a reporter, that means companies can produce their own content or their own news. Politicians can produce their own content or their own news. And as journalists, we're going to have to take on a bigger role of checking the facts, finding out if it's true or not. In a world where President Obama can produce his own YouTube videos and not take questions from reporters, it's incumbent on the reporters then to challenge those videos he's making. Just to take one example. And I think WikiLeaks is an example of that, where he says our goal is justice, and we see journalism as a tool. That's well and good, and lots of people can consume WikiLeaks material. But I hope, and I think there's still a role for the New York Times in checking those facts, in massaging them, feeling them out, figuring out what's real and what's not there. Hopefully we're going to fit into that new world order where anybody can produce anything online.
I do want to get to questions, so if you do have a question, please raise your hand. I do want to get to a politics question to you right now. We have a quote, and there's a question up there, terrific. We have a quote in our new Every 4 Years exhibit from Ariana Huffington that says, bluntly, Obama would not be president if the internet did not exist. Now, you may disagree with that, but that was from Ariana Huffington. Howard Dean, first candidate to use it effectively in 2004 to raise money and awareness of his campaign. Has the GOP caught up, and what do you see ahead in 2012? There's already been a lot of internet use this campaign cycle.
It does seem like, every election cycle, every 2 years, it seems one party or the other is ahead on the internet. One party or the other has an advantage on their use of the web, their use of social media. In a way, it did seem like it was the Democrats. Republicans have pushed back in many ways since then, did a great job in 2010 using the web. I think it's too early to tell who's on top right now in their use of the internet. But I do think we've moved to a place now where it's not thought of, the internet's not thought of as a extension of a campaign. It's thought of as a major part of the campaign. In 2008, when the Obama administration had Chris Hughes, a co-founder of Facebook, working for them in Chicago, he was sort of off to the side in his own little room. Now they're right in the center of the office. And by the way, same at the New York Times. When we built a new building in 2007, when we built it, the web people, the internet people, were still in their own building across the street. They are now literally and symbolically in the center of the newsroom. So you see in all forms of organizations now, the web being pulled into the center as opposed to being on the fringes.
That's the same scenario at the Washington Post also.
Yeah.
Right there, question.
I'd like to ask you to help us parents. 30 years ago, we all know what we didn't have today. So how do we help our children who still want to be liberal arts majors succeed in the marketing of themselves in journalism? How should we help them shape what they take in high school and certainly what they choose to take in college?
When I was in college, I had a mass communication major, which is basically journalism at Towson. And it was very helpful in many ways. I was glad to have the ethics classes, the law classes, the news writing classes, all the classes that I'm going to need no matter what. Even though I didn't know I needed them at the time, I did need them. But what was more important, I think, for me in college was being a journalist every day, practicing every day, and writing every single day, and reporting every single day. And the fact that we can do that online now is kind of amazing and worth taking advantage of. So when I had my blog in college called TV Newser, I was obsessively posting about television, trying to beat the New York Times and the Washington Post at the TV news business, trying to beat them on stories. And by doing that, I was walking around with a giant job wanted ad on myself, a job, basically a sign that read hire me. Again, I don't think I realized, if you ask my mom, she'll say, I thought I knew it all along. I don't know if I knew that was the master plan or not, but it did work out in that way. And I think now young people who are in college now as opposed to 6 years ago have an even greater chance to do that, because there's been so many cutbacks in newsrooms. There are so many voids to fill, so many pockets that they can, admittedly for free, start reporting on and writing about. If I was counseling a college junior, I would say by the time you graduate, be Googleable. Have all 10 top results for your, now unless you're John Doe, make sure all the top 10 results are about you on different sites, that you've produced different material. And although it's not a sure bet for a job, I think it's a new way to get started they didn't have in the past. The key being, of course, reporting every day. It's just like swimming, it's just like baseball or any other sport. You're gaining up a muscle memory by writing every day and by reporting every day so that you almost can do it in your sleep.
I think we have a question right in the front. While the mic is getting to Ken, I want to ask you, what was it like to be hired right out of college?
Terrifying.
To the New York Times, yeah.
And I hated it at first. I wasn't happy there the first month or so, but I expected a lot more ageism than I actually received. I thought there was going to be a lot more tension involving how young I was, given that the place does have a lot of reporters in their 50s and 60s. That said, there was a lot less than that. What there was just ambivalence. There wasn't as much direction as I thought I would get. I thought I'd be assigned a lot of stories. I thought there was this giant machine that knew what I should be doing each day. It turns out, no, it's not. It's a blank newspaper that needs to be filled with stories every day. And that was a great opportunity, as long as I was willing to be proactive, to pitch stories, to write a lot of stories. I guess that would be the other piece of advice I would add for students in high school and college. When you get a job, when you get into the marketplace, keep your head down for a while and work hard, and don't try to make much of a fuss about yourself or much noise. I've seen some people graduate in the last few years go out there, prancing around like there's some kind of gift, and then they get shot down by people who don't think they've earned their due, earned the right to do that. I think I had to, when I got to the paper, put my head down, not try to scare anybody or try to offend anybody, and just work really hard. And I hope that's not missing from this generation of 20-somethings that's going into the workforce now, who sort of expects to get whatever they want whenever they want it.
Sure.
This is a wonderful opportunity. I'm really glad to have the chance to listen to you on new media. On a generational question, I was editor for a national magazine back in the late 90s and the early 2000s that's gone out of publication. It's gone the way of so many of those. And there was a value, for instance, in the editors choosing the letters to the editor and featuring this one. We would receive many that would never make it into print, and we judged that there was no reason to. And I'm amazed at how overwhelmed one can be by content. Now, from one dinosaur to another, I transitioned into being a librarian. And now, of course, so many books are self-published, and before, just by being published, there was a certain vetting that had gone on. What's your advice to people on how to take this massive information that comes to us and make sense of it and order it in a way that was sort of done for us by previous generations in appearing on ABC News or NBC News or the New York Times?
I may have some dinosaur characteristics, but I think there are still companies and organizations doing it, like the Times, that are filtering the world for us. We see people now going to alternatives, but even on Twitter, let's take Twitter as an alternative to the New York Times or ABC. Twitter is still a version of curation of the content. It's just being done by a bunch of individuals who you're choosing to do that for you. The Huffington Post, which is a much maligned organization by journalists like me because they seem to steal content and link to it themselves. Well, they're also doing a version of curation. They're very good at it. So I think there remains an important role to be played by those groups like the ABC, CBS, NBC, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal to decide what is news each day. I think it's good that people can force us to cover stuff we're not doing otherwise by getting our attention online. But I think we're going to keep playing that aggregation and curation role. I think we're going to keep being curators of the world. And I don't worry as much about all the noise online because I'm not sure everybody's listening to it. I know I listen to it. I get overwhelmed by it. I think a lot of people in the media think that the random anonymous commenters that seem to rule the internet are really, really important, but I'm not sure everybody else is listening to those. I still think most people are still soaking up the news like a sponge from trusted sources. Although I do think it's a legitimate concern that we are siloing ourselves based on partisanship. I don't have a good answer to that. I worry about it. I worry. On the other hand, Fox News in prime time gets 3 million viewers on a good night. MSNBC gets 1 million viewers on a good night. That's only 4 million people there listening to the talking heads on a typical night. I think we all have one of them in our families, but we're not all doing it yet. So that gives me hope that there's still a role for the nonpartisan organizations to keep curating the news for us.
Right there.
I just had a question looking at the future of the funding of news media, because traditionally the bundling of newspapers meant that advertising could cross-subsidize in the way that you talked about morning television doing for the rest of television.
Right.
And I'd just be interested in how you'd comment on funding models going forward.
I imagine the next 10 years is going to involve more subscription revenue from all sorts of directions for news and somewhat less advertising revenue. Although I do think the Times and places like it will remain a mix of advertising and subscription. I'm glad the Times is now charging partly for the website. You know, if you're a casual reader of the New York Times online, you can read about 10 articles a month for free, and then we're going to ask you to start paying. Most people still don't pay. They don't need to. They don't read that many articles. But if you are loyal to the company, loyal to the brand and want more than 10 articles, then you're going to have to pay up. And that's a fair balance. We're going to keep working on that balance. But that balance is a reflection of the fact that we do need more, support from our readers and not just from advertisers. So I do see us moving in that direction. And until we get to the day, which probably won't happen, where 50 cents of your cable bill is for the New York Times. I mean, after all, it is already for CNN, right? You already pay 50 cents a month for CNN. If we ever get to that day where the New York Times is subsidized by your internet fee, gosh, that'd be great. But until we get to that point, I do see people having to pay more. And I think that means it's incumbent on us to make a product worth paying for. It's incumbent on us to make something that's worth you buying. And that's going to make us think, hopefully, more about our audience. We have access to web traffic now in a limited way. I don't really see how my stories do, but once in a while I'll hear that some story did really well. That's important for me to know. Not because I'm going to only write about the stuff you care about. I'm still going to write about everything you need to know as well. But that data can help us know our audience better. And I think that's going to help us make a product worth paying for. Generally speaking, though, yeah, I do think we're going to be paying more for news, hopefully in ways we don't realize we're paying. After all, Vogue and the Newsweek just renewed on my iPad because my girlfriend got a hold of my iPad and started signing up for magazines. So now I'm paying it every month without even realizing it. And I don't mind that so much. That's $10 a month for me is a worthy price to pay for Vogue and Newsweek and Time on my iPad. Maybe I'll start reading Vogue.
There you go. Yeah. There you go. Sir?
You speak in terms of the news and knowing who's following the news. our local newspaper in the past year or so got rid of its anonymous posting rule and started requiring folks who wanted to comment on a news story to register and to give what purportedly was their real name.
Right.
And with the idea that it would reduce some of the hate speech and so forth and hateful things that were being said under the screen of anonymity. And I was interested in your take on that, and do you think that's a good move or a bad one?
I think on balance, it's a good move to be making. The New York Times has moved in a similar direction, encouraging publicness, encouraging your name to be attached to comments. Then again, there's also a value to anonymity. I couldn't have started my blog publicly when I was in college. I had to start it anonymously without my name because I was afraid no one would take me seriously. They knew I was an 18-year-old. There was value in that anonymity for me, and then I built up credibility so that by the time I came out and revealed who I was, no one cared that I was then 19 years old and still in college. Those are some pretty limited cases, though. There's cases involving whistleblowers, there's cases that you should have anonymity, and I think websites like Gawker, for instance, are trying to figure out the balance. Gawker is now pretty much forcing you to put your to use an actual account, but they've built in a way to anonymously comment if you have to, and they sort of make it hard but possible. I think that's a good direction to be moving in. But I do think overall on the web, we're going to be moving more toward a public web where your identity is clear, thanks in large part to Facebook, which is the 800-pound or 800 million gorilla in the room. It has 800 million users, maybe 900 million now on Facebook. Almost everybody on there is supposed to have their real name. And that's moving us toward a web where real names are currency. Facebook, by the way, I mean, what an opportunity for news. What a way to distribute news. If we can figure out how to crack that, Facebook's going to be a really powerful way to get news and get content. I don't think we're there yet, but it's exciting as a prospect.
We had a question. Wait, go ahead.
No one on this side has had a chance.
Okay.
The Washington Post Ombudsman this morning talked about how the Post is doing some really fine catch-up on things like speeding up how fast you can get the news once you click on the link and so forth. I think the difference between their iPad app and the New York Times iPad app are, it's pretty extraordinary. What is there about the
Who's better?
Come on.
No, I haven't used
it. Well, first of all, they didn't even come out with one for several months after you all did.
Okay.
And then it was clunky. And it looked particularly clunky because the New York Times app was so smooth.
Right.
And the New York Times app by then had set the standard for what we expected, so that you went sideways, you didn't go up and down, and things like that when you scrolled. So my question is, what is there about the leadership at the New York Times that they have been able to be forward-thinking?
I love softballs. That's great.
It's the New York Times app.
Yeah, I appreciate it. It's a weird time for our company, to be candid with you, because we've been without a CEO for about 6 months. I sort of thought you were going to ask me, why we're so behind. But you're right that in terms of technology, we are way ahead of other newspapers. And it's because I think, I would name two reasons. I'd say one is scale. By having the biggest audience online in terms of newspapers to begin with, we come from a position of strength. I would say the second reason is that until recently, we owned other newspapers regionally. We owned the Boston Globe still. We did used to own TV stations. We own About.com. So we have other assets that have helped us learn the web. But I loved the Ombudsman's column today from the Post because he pointed out that the most important part of these newspapers going forward is their technology divisions. That these newspapers, if you take a broad view of journalism, newspapers are turning into technology companies that happen to print a newspaper and someday might not. So they have to think of themselves as a technology company first and a newspaper company second. We may end up having a world where instead of printing the paper at all, we just put it on iPads, and that's requiring this real revolutionary change to these companies. It's no wonder why they're struggling. I think the Times has been faster than others because we had such a big audience to begin with, and because we had those other assets in the company to help us learn. That said, I would argue we are needing to work much faster and much harder at gaining advantage online. Because on the web, and especially on the iPad, think about your competitive set for a minute. We are not just competing with the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post. We are competing with CNN and the BBC and Al Jazeera. Anybody that has an app on the iTunes store is our news competitor. It can be a pretty intimidating prospect. And that's why I'm glad we are where we are with the iPad app, for instance. We're already pretty far ahead of other newspapers. But we have to think we're in the same business now as CNN and the BBC and all these other international news brands that in some ways have a head start over us.
I think we have time for 2 more questions. I believe this gentleman here, and then we'll do the gentleman up there. And then.
So as a current college journalist and a consumer of news, I really appreciate that you embrace new media and social media. But what I'm interested in is kind of also the dark side of new media in terms of print journalism and reporting. You see a lot of news organizations which are now issuing reporters iPhone 4s and expecting them to take on more roles in terms of not only producing stories but doing video and doing photos. And I'm curious on your feelings towards that as the industry and as for older journalists and young journalists and what's expected.
There are days where it can be tiring to have to do things on multiple platforms, but I think of it as, every journalist has an ego, right? We all have egos. Yes, sir. We all want to be reached by we want to reach the most people we possibly can. If we could, we'd be read by every person in the country. And I think the reason why there's this push to video and to audio and to text and have all these platforms is to recollect that audience that we've started to lose in print. So if I have to wake up a little earlier to go on our 10 a.m. live web show, I don't mind it so much because I'm reaching a different audience that might not have read my print story. And by the way, just to, it's a perfect segue from the question about the iPad, because when we are the same as CNN, when we are the same as the BBC, we're going to have to be in the video business and in the photo business and in the audio business. We produce about 20 minutes a day of live TV on the web. The Wall Street Journal, our biggest competitor, does 4 hours a day. It terrifies me. And we'll catch up. We'll have to, because we're both going to have to be TV networks on the internet someday. And I don't mind that so much, but what it requires is the editors, your bosses, to recognize when you're working too hard and to recognize that you can't be everywhere at the same time. I'm lucky that I have an editor who will sometimes force me to take a day off before I realize I need one. And as long as we have that support, I think it works. There was a day I was in Joplin covering the tornado that struck there. I had been going to Chicago to cover Oprah Winfrey's last show. What a weird transition that was. But I'm a weather geek, and I could get to Joplin, and the national desk that assigns those stories knew I was interested. So I went, and when I got there, I couldn't call the news desk in New York because the cell phone towers were mostly down, and I certainly couldn't email text of what I was seeing and reading and who I was interviewing because the cell phone towers were down. But I could send text messages because the towers were just strong enough to get out texts. So my best reporting ended up on Twitter because I could tweet, I could send text messages to Twitter and get my material out. Thankfully, the website realized that. The New York Times put a link on the homepage right to my Twitter feed, which is crazy to do, but was smart to do. And they were directing people to where I could report. And on a day like that, where I was doing photos, I was doing a video, once I found cell service, I was doing text for the paper, I was doing tweets for the web. All of that worked really well together. And there's times where all those mediums end up creating a nice symphony, as long as, like I said, your editor realizes when you've gone too far, when you're burnt out, I think.
Yeah. Final question.
Brian, one of the people that's featured prominently, as you know, in the documentary that wasn't shown is Bill Keller. And you were sort of talking about that kind of generational ambivalence when you came into the newsroom. And I would imagine that some of that persists to this day. I wanted to go back to, I can't remember if it was a year or two ago, but sort of the Bill Keller, Arianna Huffington Post spat. And here you are as the embodiment of new media. And there were many that I think sort of castigated Bill Keller for coming across as the embodiment of old media in that back and forth. And I'm just kind of wondering your perception of that from your chair as it played out. And was it sort of, I don't know, almost weird for you in terms of what you represent in a newsroom that clearly to other people represented something very different?
I don't recall it being weird, but I do find it strange when we get into fights with a site like the Huffington Post, because the Huffington Post is many, many things, just like the New York Times is many, many things. These debates about old versus new media are so much more gray than they are black and white. And I think most people in the fights even get that. I think Ariana, if we pressed her, because let's take Huffington Post for example. Huffington Post just won its first Pulitzer ever, which puts it on the same playing field as the New York Times. Huffington Post has 170 journalists and editors. We have about 1,200. We would say they're not the same kinds of editors, but some of them are pretty great editors and reporters. And they've won their first Pulitzer. In the summer, they're going to come online with a web network, 12 hours a day of live TV on the internet. And like I said, we're only doing 20 minutes, so they're going to be far ahead of us in that way. And they do represent new media, but they're doing old media stuff also by having reporters and getting a Pulitzer. So, I see new media and old media, and in this example, New York Times and Huffington Post, coming together and becoming relatively similar. We're always going to do some things better than they are. They might always do something better than we are. But the differences are blurring so much now, in the same way the difference between CNN and the New York Times is blurring, that those debates are going to become less and less relevant. So it is strange sometimes to watch us pick those fights or for us to respond to those fights, because I look at our website and I think we're doing a great job of summarizing the whole web for people and for linking to other sites. And that's all the stuff the Huffington Post is praised for doing. The future of the web is having all of these brands, which will seem more like each other because we're all competing against each other. And to me, it's a pretty exciting, flourishing environment. I like being able to compete against the Huffington Post and the Wall Street Journal and CNN. It's going to make a better news environment for us. And so I think we've in some ways passed that phase of debating old versus new media. We're still, those fights still pop up once in a while, but I see us moving out of that phase and now moving more into a phase about, okay, how do we market ourselves, promote ourselves, sell ourselves, convince you to pay for us, in sufficient numbers to be able to keep competing. I think we're started in a big way in that way. And then the new editor, Jill Abramson, who replaced Bill Keller last fall, she's now the first female editor of the New York Times ever. She purposely doesn't go to the front page meetings anymore. These are the meetings we have twice a day, 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. They decide what's on the front page tomorrow. They're the most important media in the world. You decide the front page stories, and it's still nice to be on the front page. It's great to be in print. But she doesn't go to the meetings on purpose because she wants the focus to be on the website. And I find that to be a very interesting moment in time, that she no longer goes to the front page meeting. She does go to the morning web meeting, though. And I think that says it all, that's where we're going. The print edition is going to be around for a while, but the web is where it's at. The web is the priority. And I'm glad to be at that place at that time in history.
And we'll leave it there. Ladies and gentlemen, Brian Stelter of the New York Times. Thank you, Brian.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Thanks so much.
Cool.